Well, let me start with Hurricane Harvey, if I could. How do you begin to assess how well the U.S. can weather storms like this one? What are you watching at this point?
Well, of course, I think one of the issues is that with global warming and sea level rise, what we are seeing is the effects of these storms amplified. And so basically, we're going to have to spend a lot of money, I think, in hardening our facilities, our infrastructure against this kind of damage. I might say that a year ago I was in Florida, where they're obviously also susceptible to these kinds of coastal storms, and just one electric utility there had already spent billions of dollars precisely to defend itself against this kind of storm. So looking forward, obviously what I hope is that we remain committed to battling global warming so that we can minimize this kind of impact, this kind of expense, and of course the tragedy that so many people have experienced.
You were integrally involved in the crafting of the Joint Comprehensive Accord with Iran on nuclear weapons, and I'm sure you've been listening to the rhetoric from both sides here now that it's been implemented. How worried are you about the integrity of that deal going forward?
Well, first of all, I think every indication is that Iran continues to abide by the letter of the agreement. It's a very detailed agreement, and every indication from the international inspectors is that they are abiding by it. If they abide by it, in my view, it would be a terrible mistake for us to walk away. We will be alone, we'll be isolated. The Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians intend to carry on. So again, we would ironically just isolate ourselves if we did that. And in the meantime, while we continue with our Gulf allies and Israel to combat other aspects of Iran's behavior, doing so without any nuclear weapon threat certainly is to our advantage.
You're out of government, of course, but is it your sense that Iran has been upholding the terms of that agreement?
Well, certainly. In fact, the international inspectors indicated that. I was recently with IAEA, the international inspector leadership, saw no indication to suggest the contrary. So this is an agreement that does not address many of the other activities that we have problems with, but we should not walk away from this agreement as long as it's being honored and, as I said, takes any risk of a nuclear weapon off the table as we address the other issues. I might also add, we just talked a few minutes ago about Harvey and global warming and the like. If we walk away from the Paris Agreement, then we walk away from the Iran Agreement. The entire reliability of the United States in its multilateral obligations will come more and more into question, and that will defeat our ability to address any openings we might have in other hard problems, like with Russia, like with North Korea. We need to honor our agreements as they continue to be honored by others and serve our purpose as well.
On the issue of Russia, the U.S. was working closely with Russia on nuclear proliferation, in particular drawing down nuclear stockpiles. The Secretary of State described our relationship with Russia recently as at a low point. What are the consequences of that for nuclear proliferation?
Well, I think there's no question. I would agree with Secretary Tillerson that our relationship with Russia is somewhat in the ditch at the moment, obviously. But we feel very strongly that we must continue to work on non-proliferation issues, on nuclear weapons control issues. We cannot afford to see a nuclear weapon used, that's for sure. And unfortunately, the level of our dialogue with Russia, even on issues of mutual interest and mutual security, is actually at a lower level, I would say, than we had in the Cold War. So I think it's very important that we find ways, we're not giving free passes, obviously, on election interference, on Ukraine, on some of the Syria issues, but we need to address those issues that serve our national security and their national security in the nuclear arena. That's just very, very important.
There have been, by my count, I think 13 missile tests by North Korea this year alone. How much has the picture changed since you were in office? When you look at how North Korea's nuclear development program is going, are we seeing just provocations here? Or are we seeing new technology? Is it possible, do you think, for the world community to step in at this point to forestall future development by the North Koreans?
I think that's a very important point that you raise, because we often tend to consider their tests, missile tests or nuclear explosive tests, as provocations. There may be an element of that, but I think we also have to realize that these are part of a systematic program to develop those capabilities. Frankly, I don't see how we can address this without opening up some form of dialogue. I did not say negotiation, some form of dialogue, and certainly strong dialogue with China, with South Korea, with Japan, in a much broader context than I have seen. In other words, nuclear weapons by themselves is not, in my view, the issue we should be addressing. We still, of course, have the goal, and we must retain the goal, of eventually denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. But we have to address the overall security requirements of the key countries in the region, and of course feed into that what will be our own American military presence there. But a broader security discussion is absolutely essential.
Last question here about nuclear power in the U.S. The Southern Company in recent days elected to continue with construction, expansion of a nuclear plant in eastern Georgia. I wonder what that signals to you about nuclear power in this country. There was a lot of debate over whether to continue. This is, by my estimation, I think the only construction on a nuclear reactor in the U.S. right now. How optimistic are you about the future of nuclear power in the U.S.?
Look, there's no doubt that nuclear power is challenged right now, both because of some of the closures we are seeing of existing plants, and of course the challenges following the Westinghouse bankruptcy of constructing the plants in both South Carolina and Georgia. Now, in Georgia, the decision by Southern Company to continue, conditionally continue, is very, very important, because I certainly think nuclear power remains a very important area for us in the United States. And I want to emphasize, not simply to address global climate change, although it's very important for that, being an emission-free technology, but it's also a strong nuclear supply chain in the United States is very important for our national security posture. It underpins what we can do globally in non-proliferation. It's a supply chain that our Navy depends upon for nuclear reactors, for submarines and aircraft carriers. So there are several reasons why it's important, and I think the Southern decision on the Vogtle reactors is certainly a positive sign, although we all know there's a long ways to go yet before those reactors are finished. And even better would be if a new company could come in and perhaps even rescue the South Carolina reactors. It would be a big boost for nuclear power, a big boost for our climate approach, and a big boost for our national security.